morning everyone. A very warm welcome to our Science of Reading webinar. I'm Donna Hazzard and I'm going to be chairing today's session. So I'm going to begin by introducing our panel. On my right we have Dr. Geraldine Magennis-Clarke. Geraldine is Senior Lecturer in Literacy and Education here in St Mary's. And beside me is Maria McGoran. Maria is Literacy Support Teacher in Holy Family Primary School in North Belfast. Beside me is Philip Lavery. Philip is Vice Principal and Literacy Coordinator in Mount St Michael's Primary School in Randallstown. And then we have Jodi Snowden. Jodi studied for education in Florida Atlantic University. She worked in Florida as a teacher for 5 years before moving to Northern Ireland with her family. Jodi is an advocate for dyslexia awareness and she co-founded the Dyslexia Awareness Northern Ireland, or DANI, organisation. So we're going to begin, everybody, just by each panel member is just going to take the floor and just give us a few minutes telling us about the science of reading from their particular lens. So we're going to start with Geraldine.
Thank you, Donna. Well, the science of reading, what is it? It really is a rising consensus in the last 50 years or so across multiple research platforms as to how the brain learns to read, what happens when it's going well, what happens when those processes break down. And I suppose most importantly for teachers in schools, it lets us know what are the most impactful and effective instructional practices that will help more children, more of the time, and sooner in their school careers to become successful readers. So I suppose in a nutshell, it is really about talking about what we know in regard to working with the grain of the brain. And so when we look at the brain, really one of the big messages in the science of reading is that we are primed for speech, but not for reading. And so the speech and language comprehension centres of the brain are there when we are born, but those parts that are used for, which will become the reading centres, are not there when we are born and if we don't learn how to read. So if you think of the analogy of having a spare bedroom in your house and you want to change it into a home office, you have to deliberately do something with it in order to reconfigure the architecture. And so that's where deliberate instruction comes in. So if we look at the ladder of reading and writing as constructed by Nancy Young, she shows us that in any population really you will have varying degrees of instruction required. So at the top of the ladder you have those children who seem to read despite us and not because of us. So it kind of comes to them quite effortlessly, it would seem. The caveat here is that everyone needs instruction to a greater or lesser degree of intensity, and how systematic that might be depends on where the reader is on this ladder. So right at the top, you have a small percentage who will need enrichment, obviously, and extension. As you move down through that ladder, right down to the bottom rungs, you will need a greater intensity and explicitness and systematic approach to how you teach reading. And of course, along the right-hand side there, you will see factors such as the environmental factors and psychological factors will mediate how your instruction is decided upon and how successful your children will become as a consequence of that. And of course, teachers are very well used to using data to direct their decisions. So what are the big ticket items that we should be paying attention to? Gough and Tumner in the mid-80s came up with a simple view of reading, which is not actually simple, but they pare it down to two big components: decoding, which is often called word recognition, and language comprehension, which is about the features and characteristics of spoken language. And so the decoding and word recognition is literally that. It's about breaking the code, understanding the code. You will notice there is a multiplication sign between these two boxes because there is a multiplier effect here. So we're not talking about having a low score in one and compensating in the other. That cannot happen. It doesn't work like that. You need both scores to be high in order to impact reading comprehension. And reading comprehension is when we hit the written word. So that's when we introduce the print. So both need to be strong. And then I suppose one of the most important infographics in my view is Scarborough's reading ropes. So Scarborough took those two big areas and she deconstructed them to give us much more detail when operating in the classroom. And you'll see each of the specific parts of the rope. I think the important thing to note here is on the left-hand side, each of those individual strands within each of those two subcomponents start out quite loosely. And then when instruction begins, they start to lap around each other quite tightly. And then the two ropes begin to bind together very tightly as we move toward the right-hand side towards skilled and fluent instruction. Now, what is implicit in this rope is the idea of fluency. So if we look at the bottom arrow going left to right, increasing automaticity in word comprehension speaks of fluency. If we look at the top arrow, increasingly strategic instruction and understanding in language comprehension speaks of fluency. And in some of these graphics, you will see a big arrow going from left to right through the rope, and that's oral reading fluency, which must be specifically taught. And I suppose what I would finish by saying in encapsulating the science of reading is that Timothy Shanahan, a very eminent professor in the field in the last 50 years, has said the science of reading's greatest gift really is it reduces the margins of uncertainty for us as instructors. There's no panacea out there for human life and learning. It's so complex, but we reduce the margins of guessing, I suppose, when it comes to planning and teaching young children.
Geraldine, thank you very much. I think that gives us a lovely context and background to our discussion today about the science of reading. You've really set, the scene for us very, very nicely and very clearly. Thank you. So we're going to turn to Philip now.
Okay, thank you, Donna. Thank you, Geraldine, and thanks very much for the invitation to be here this morning. I've actually, through just informal discussions, learned a lot already. So listen, just to remind you, my name is Philip Lavery, and I have been teaching since 1989, which is a long time ago, first in St. Joseph's in Crumlin, and for the last 20 years in Mount St. Michael's in Randallstown, where I am the Vice Principal and I'm the Literacy Coordinator. So I think the first thing to say is that I love my job, I love teaching, and but I love it more when I get really engaged and excited about learning. And sometimes you get a wee bit disconnected as a teacher and a leader in schools by initiative after initiative and by paperwork after paperwork. And especially those that just maybe just tick a box and don't necessarily impact directly on children's learning. I have a background in history and drama, interested in politics and sports, so kind of the arts end of things. However, post-lockdown during the summer of 2021, and reflecting on scores that we would have, our PTEs, standardised tests. Obviously, as literacy coordinator, you're always continue looking to raise standards, and we've been doing it, and action plan after action plan for years. And I was just looking to see if we could do something differently, and that's why I was drawn to your CPD, Geraldine, in that July. And it was the CPD on fluency as part of the St. Mary's courses. Can highly recommend them, by the way. There's a plug for next year. So I was curious and excited about using this sort of focus on fluency to try and improve standards, and even just to improve the interest in reading. So we had started to move towards a whole class reading approach, certainly in P5, 6 and 7. And so this was another way of maybe trying to support us in that movement towards it. But I suppose the input that you had and then subsequent discussions that we had, it kind of got me thinking more about how fluency is seen as this bridge between the decoding and the word recognition and language comprehension. And that's, as you mentioned previously, Scarborough's rope. That's what we're looking for all our children to become skilled readers. And the most important thing that I learnt on that course was actually fluency just wasn't this idea that somebody had plucked out of the air. There was evidence and there was research behind it. And it was on the back of that I was able to take it to staff to say, not that this is a bright idea of mine, but this actually is from my own research and research of others, to say that greater fluency increased fluency amongst children will allow them to develop their comprehension skills more effectively. So this was our other approach, as opposed to just repeating the same old thing over and over again. So as I said before, it's the bridge between phonics and language comprehension. The infographic highlighted to me for the first time the importance of things really such as background knowledge and vocabulary, syntax, in helping to develop these skills. I think we always did that, but I think through the conversations that we had and through the reading that I did, these became more relevant, more pertinent. So I've started to read and to listen podcast wise around these things, and this is a whole world that's opened up for me, and it's very compatible with how we are starting to teach reading in our school, which is a whole class approach, certainly from primary 5 up. Now when I say whole class, that we share a novel, but we still have focus groups for those children who need kind of decodable books or more support. But this notion gives everybody a chance to read. It's inclusive, and through that, there are more opportunities for children to focus on fluency. And of course, the most important thing when you introduce a topic like that or an idea like that to children is to let them know what it is and be explicit about it. And to also to give them an understanding of what a good reader is. A good reader is not someone who reads really quickly and makes no mistakes. A good reader who is someone who looks at the passage or whatever it is they're reading and can read it and develop show their understanding of it in how they read. And that's language comprehension. It's not necessarily answering 6 questions on who was the main character, what happened on the Wednesday, and whatever it might be. So I have found this past year or so really, really empowering. I have a fantastic staff in school, and we've started to grow fluency. Of course, now we're starting to look at fluency. We also want to look at vocabulary, and we also want to look at a background knowledge about content. And sometimes I think that's also what has disappeared from a lot of the teaching that's happening. We are very good sometimes, as I think I mentioned to you before. Sometimes we can be really good generally at the decoding bit, teaching our children to read, but actually teaching our children to become readers and enjoying reading what they read and sharing what they read and being enthused about it. That's where we need to go. We need to do that. We need to model that ourselves as professionals, and we need to encourage it in our children. So that's my little blurb for the start.
Great, Philip. Thank you very much. I think just to pick up on one point that you mentioned there, I mean, that's a lovely example of the science of reading in action, and you've given this lovely kind of a first-hand experience of implementing it in your school, or an element of it. But Tim Shanahan says that there's no consensus of what the science of reading is, but what he does say is that it has to be evidence-based. And you talked about the research and, going down the research route before, you explored fluency and before you brought your teachers and your staff on board, in developing that one particular skill.
We have had lots of examples, but of course I can't name any off the top of my head, but lots of examples of little strategies.
Yes.
We do this, and this is a great way to get them reading, or we do clouds of wonder, or we do this, or we do, but why are we doing these things? So the science of reading, with the evidence and the research behind it, is starting to colour in the why, and it's allowing us to link the bottom level of that rope, the phonological awareness and the decoding, with the top level. And I know we have Scarborough's rope in every classroom in the school now, because when we're hearing reading, and if there's an area of concern, let's refer back to that. Let's see, is it something to do with they didn't understand the vocabulary, or did they not know how to approach the word, to address the word, to decode the word? And there's a journey to go. It's not going to happen overnight. So my aim to increase our PTE scores won't necessarily be fulfilled in the next number of years, but we have to grow an ethos and a culture in our school, and I'd suggest all schools, where we're trying to, with the science of reading, really get down to the nitty-gritty of how children learn to read, and then make them readers, and for their future lives. It's so important.
Excellent. Thanks, Philip. So I'm now going to turn to Maria. So Maria, I'll hand over to you.
So I just want to give a bit of background as to how I'm sat with all you lovely people here this morning. So I began teaching over 20 years ago, and for 15 of those years I taught mainstream and taught in a whole class setting. And then about 5 years ago I took on the role of literacy support teacher in Holy Family. And I didn't necessarily feel that I had any qualifications that really made me the best person for that job. However, I'd had 15 years of experience in teaching primary 1 through to primary 4, teaching reading obviously every day. So off I went into the role of literacy support teacher. And that was predominantly supporting children who were struggling readers in primary 3 and primary 4, with a little bit of intervention sort of at the end of primary 2, recognising that need for early intervention. So that's what I did. And for the first sort of, I would say, year to 2 years, I basically was mirroring how I taught reading in the classroom, only in a small group setting. And I went about my business and I did what I was doing. We were looking at high frequency words and flashcards and all of those ways that I had taught reading to a whole class. I just was mirroring that, as I say, in a small group setting. And after a while, I really just felt that it wasn't adding up. You know, when you're not in a classroom setting and you're not dealing with the daily dramas and all that's going on in classroom life, and you're not teaching maths and PDMU and art and music, it's not just your responsibility, it's the most important responsibility. But when you're not dealing with all those other things, you need to know that within your role, you are bringing the value added to these children. You know, they have had 2, 3, 4 years of this teaching in the classroom. Why? And I kept nagging in my head, why would I think that if these children have not mastered this, or these children are not proficient after 3 or 4 years of having this day and daily in the classroom, why would this same approach be successful for these children in a small group setting? It just didn't fit. And it was very obvious to me that there were a lot of these children who were sitting in front of me had dyslexia and had specific literacy difficulties, and I felt ill-equipped to be able to support them. So basically my road and my route to the science of reading came about through my need to support children with dyslexia. Dyslexia was really my route into the science of reading. So it was out walking and listening to podcasts that I first heard the term science of reading, and it really was a light bulb moment. And where I had felt that, you know, I wasn't seeing the gains in my small groups beforehand, and I really did feel that there was a missing piece. And I just thought, well, maybe this is it. Maybe this is the missing piece. And I began to delve much further into what the science of reading was and all the research, and how that research should then be impacting on our practice and on our instruction in the classroom. So that very important piece being phonemic awareness, and how children really need to be really strong with phonemic awareness and being able to manipulate all of those sounds and isolating first medial sounds and first sounds and all of those things, substituting, blending, segmenting. And I really went to town with these withdrawal group children on these skills, and really, really hammering home this word sound recognition, not using memorization as a strategy, not doing what I had done in the classroom, which was flashcard after flashcard, hoping that through some process of osmosis that these children were going to retain these 100 high frequency words, when it is not cognitively, you know, possible or realistic for us to expect children at, you know, this age to be able to do all of this. And so I really went to town on that with my withdrawal groups. However, I knew that this should not be reserved for children when they become struggling readers. This should not be the best practice for children when they're primary 3 and primary 4. We needed to have this embedded, and this to be our first line of instruction, our first line of teaching. So we had to have it. I knew it had to begin in primary 1. So I then went to my principal, and I'm in a very fortunate position to have a very understanding, open-minded principal who knows that if I come to her with something with this level of enthusiasm and interest and sending her through lots of articles and research this and evidence this, that she knew that, you know, this is something we need to stand up and take notice of. So I spent my summer last year preparing a professional development session for our whole staff, which I developed, which I presented during the August training days last year. And I feel, and I can say that I feel like I really enthused staff as to what the science of reading was all about, what the research was, how the brain learns to read, and how that should then impact on our practice and our instruction in teaching reading. So we knew that we weren't going to achieve everything in one go, that we would have to take it in bite-sized chunks. So we decided that we would start with our primary one. It made sense for us to begin this with our journey into the science of reading to start with our new intake primary ones last year, which is what we did. I worked very, very closely with our 3 really enthusiastic primary one teachers. I went into rooms, I supported them, we looked at the theory, we looked at resources, we gathered curriculum, we did all of that because we knew that this was what we needed to do to help these children. And we now have those children who are now our current primary 2s this year. And I can say that we are seeing the fruits of our labour, because we have children who have very solid phonemic awareness skills. We have children who are so fluent and automatic with phoneme grapheme matching. And we have children who see themselves as readers because they can bring decoding to those books. And a huge thing that we did as well as part of that which was a budgetary consideration. And again, I had to go to Siobhan and say, look, this is that important, was that we moved away for our foundation stage from leveled readers, and we brought in decodable text. And I knew that this was thousands of pounds worth of budget, but it was that important because I do feel that there is a disconnect at the moment. I would say that right across the land, there's nobody not teaching phonics. However, there's a huge disconnect between the teaching of phonics and children actually having the practice of putting that into meaningful context in a book. So we're at the very beginnings of our journey. These children are primary 1, they've moved into primary 2 now, and now we're going again with our new primary 1s for this year. But I'm very happy to be on the journey and not just thinking about starting the journey. And I definitely think that we are beginning to see this all come and fit together. And I can speak for myself and say that it is probably the last couple of years is the first time where I can say I feel as a teacher that I know how to teach reading, that I teach children to read. I don't teach around reading. And I think that when you feel as a teacher that you are actually doing the most important job, which is teaching children to read, then I feel you feel that sense of worth and fulfilment.
Maria, thank you. That's a really enlightening story. And thank you so much. And I'm going to turn to Jodi now. So Jodi.
Yes, hi. Hello. I just want to start by saying thank you to St. Mary's for this wonderful opportunity, and to Dr. Magennis for reaching out for me to participate. Your passion for the science of reading is palpable. And I'm most certainly in good company here, so thank you. Today I'm going to share some quotes that I think help connect the experiences of children with dyslexia, their parents, educators, and those in training colleges with the critical role that the science of reading has in the prevention of early literacy difficulties. The first quote is from a 2001 report of the Dyslexia Task Force in Northern Ireland. 20 years ago, it stated, the group recommends effective early intervention to minimize the risk of children suffering the negative experience of academic failure and associated consequences. It is essential that these interventions include whole school policies, in-class approaches, and individual interventions. I'd be remiss if I didn't share that the task force also recommended that there be a dyslexia specialist in every school to help students as well as their fellow teachers. Flash forward 20 years, in 2020, the Northern Ireland Audit Office raised concerns and made a similar recommendation as the task force by stating, the sooner a child's needs are identified and appropriate support is put in place, the more responsive the child will be. So the importance of early intervention is clearly established in these reports, and there have been several reports over the years. You struggle to find any that recommend that we should wait for academic failure before intervening. They are all pro-prevention, and that's certainly reassuring given the serious mental health consequences of low literacy. So not to forget the huge societal costs as well. The challenge those in the dyslexia community are facing is seeing those recommendations put into meaningful action. and having a clear mandatory framework for early and evidence-based interventions put in place. For early prevention intervention, the framework needs to be around those skills under the word recognition section of Scarborough's reading rope, which Dr. Magennis shared with us earlier. A little SOR name drop here, but through my work with Nessy Learning, I recently had the great honor of meeting the reading researcher, Dr. Anita Archer, at the Reading League conference in New York. And Dr. Archer has famously said, "There is no comprehension strategy powerful enough to make up for the fact of you not being able to read the words." We need a clear framework that ensures that all students learn to read the words in early primary school. Okay. 2 more quotes, and they come from a 2021 committee meeting on dyslexia, where a parent, Kate McGoran, bravely shared her difficult journey getting help from P2 on for her son Aiden's literacy difficulties. Sadly, this is a common story that we hear at Dyslexia Awareness, and this is not putting the onus on teachers alone. I speak to many who feel ill-equipped in the important job of being on the front line. This takes a village. Full credit goes to Ali Lewis for these quotes, who, along with Nikki Humphreys and myself, created Dyslexia Awareness NI. Ali spent several hours transcribing the 3-hour meeting so that we could have these quotes. So representatives from CYPS and EA Literacy spoke at the meeting about the prevalence of dyslexia. In terms of Northern Ireland, studies do indicate that approximately 25% of pupils experience dyslexic-type difficulties, and around 10% will present difficulties that require additional support to be provided. So with 335,000 students in Northern Ireland, we can imagine how many students are affected by this. And this links very well to a 2012 report by the National Literary Trust, and said that 1 in 5 adults in Northern Ireland have low literacy skills. So you're looking at that same 25%. The next and final quote is from the same team and truly connects this all to the body of scientifically based research about reading and issues related to reading, known as the science of reading. They stated, "For dyslexic learners, it is of critical importance that we achieve a collective understanding of what works best for them, what constitutes early intervention and identification, how as an education system we can deliver best practice that is informed by local and international evidence. Research shows that when educational strategies are implemented in the classroom to support pupils with dyslexia, there are benefits for them and for all children." I couldn't agree more. There's an image that will be shared from Nancy Young's reading ladder, which I think illustrates wonderfully how many students can be helped by the structured literacy approach that is well documented in the science of reading literature. I shared this all with you today as a person with dyslexia myself and as a parent of children with dyslexia. I was once a young child struggling in school to demonstrate my intelligence in school-based tasks. The leaders at Nessy Learning, Mike Jones and Tiffany James, were also once young children with dyslexia, but they were lucky as well. Being literate in Northern Ireland or anywhere in the world should not be a matter of luck. It should be a matter of science, of best practice, and of human rights. Thank you.
Thank you, Jodi. Those are very powerful quotes, aren't they? And that statistic, 1 in 5, in struggling with literacy in Northern Ireland, specifically reading, I mean, it's shocking, isn't it? It's just, and it really sets the context for why this is just so important. What I would like to say to the viewers is that we're just all learning about the science of reading here ourselves. We're just embarking on this journey and kind of finding our feet as we go. But as you can see, there's fabulous work going on, in our schools here, and it's so heartening, isn't it, just to see. So again, viewers, thank you. You sent in some terrific questions. So we're going to turn now to just having a discussion around the questions. And Geraldine, if you don't mind, I'll start with you. And Anne asks, what's the best way to manage learning in the classroom when a child is struggling to retain phonic sounds?
Well, I think probably Anne is talking for many teachers in that particular scenario. I would say is to move back to phonemic awareness that Maria was talking about. Move back to that letter sound correspondence and do some more intensive work on it with the spoken speech, so that the children can hear and manipulate the sounds in spoken speech, and to do the blending, isolating, segmenting, discrimination, deletion, substitution activities that I'm sure she is already doing, but to really go full on with that, and so that when the child picks up more in the spoken sounds, and then when the graphemes are added in after that, it will hopefully become more seamless. And if the child has a learning difficulty, it will take a little bit longer than that. But to go back to that phonemic awareness piece and be intense about that and systematic about that in your scope and sequence. And once there are, the CVC words and VC words are in place, then you're really ready to go to the written speech. But the phonemic awareness part is really important. Sometimes that gets jumped over a little bit quickly.
And it's just making sure all the essential building blocks are there, and going right back to those building blocks and rebuilding them until that wall is kind of firmly, established and the foundations are there.
Absolutely.
And something that we have used, just to add to talk to that, we have found great success with Nessy as a tool for our children, particularly at that level where they're only beginning to be introduced to letter sound correspondence, the Hurry Reading programme, which is just lovely and so fun and so engaging, that just brings those things to life for the children. And it can be done on iPads, and it's a great, the children interact with it really well. And we have seen a lot of reward from children using the Hurry Reading programme in school.
And it's that joy and pleasure that's going to give motivation and engagement and perseverance, which is what's needed. Thank you, Maria. If we turn to Jodi, perhaps. Jodi, Neve asks, how do you motivate reluctant readers?
Okay. So one way to motivate reluctant readers is obviously to give them text that is at their level and gives them the ability to be successful in their reading, because it's not fun to read when it's difficult. So we want them to be able to enjoy it, but then it's about finding that balance, because if we have an older reluctant reader, children don't tend to be reluctant readers in that they don't like the book. I mean, who doesn't love beautiful stories and tales? Of course, every child does, where we're born. What they're reluctant about is most likely their decoding skills. So it's finding that balance of books that they can enjoy, but books that they can read. For example, Barrington Stokes has some low ability, high interest books. And so they're less, I guess, what older kids would refer to as baby books. Obviously, the better goal is to not have children having these decoding issues. So that's a great way to motivate them. But if we're in that situation, which we clearly are for some students, then those books are fantastic. Also, audiobooks, otherwise known as ear reading. There has been plenty of research out there now to say that there is no difference as far as our ability to understand and gain vocabulary from reading, listening to a book as it is to reading a book. So, and it allows them to also kind of read books, or at least listen to the books that their peers are listening to, because that is actually a huge social cost of not being able to read as well, is not being able to kind of enjoy with your peers and talk about Harry Potter and talk about Percy Jackson. And graphic novels. Reluctant readers tend to love graphic novels. So you have authors like Dave Pilkey, who actually has dyslexia and ADHD himself. They're very popular. It's not every parent doesn't love them. A lot of children do. But I just think it's about having your child enjoy, or your students enjoy reading. I mean, that's what we want, whether we can't turn our nose up if the child is happy in reading a book. So there's that. And Liz Pitchin, who also happens to be dyslexic, and she has the Tom Gates books, which are also graphic novels, are quite popular. So, yeah.
And Teresa Kremen has done tremendous work and research in that whole field of a reading for pleasure pedagogy, which is, what you're describing there, which is just so important. And it has to underpin all the other mechanical kind of tuition that we do. We need that top-down balance, don't we?
Absolutely.
Great. And Philip, if I could turn to you. Kevin asks, oh, what did we say? Where did we go? What advice would you give on using a range of platforms effectively? For example, accelerated reading or something like that.
Well, no, thank you for your question, Kevin. We have accelerated reading program in school, and I think we probably have it running now for about 12 years. The children really enjoy it. We use it on a kind of a reward basis and recognition basis as well. So it is a good platform, but it's not necessarily teaching anybody reading. It's maybe a way of catching them reading and recognizing them for their reading and awarding them for their reading or whatever you want to call. But it's not teaching. And I know that there are some instances where I've seen it seem to be the teaching program as opposed to actually a way of affirming the reading that the children are doing. So yeah, they're good, but they're not all that. Sort of, if that's a way of putting it. And yes, we would also use their, for example, in accelerated reading, we use their star reading program as our literacy, our reading test, our reading standardized scores come from it. So that's, from that point of view, it's really good. It's another avenue for children to read, to take a test. There's a certain amount of enthusiasm and buzz about that in the classroom. That's all really positive, but that isn't necessarily, that's not what I would be now, having been converted to the science of reading, to say that it's really good, but there needs to be more to it than that. And it's just on your point, this notion that children need to be included in their reading. So you talk about reluctant readers, they need to be included. When Geraldine was out with us, she used a fabulous phrase in carrying the load. Now, down the school in primary 1s and 2s and possibly 3s, the teacher does an awful lot of the carrying of the load for the pupils in reading like a big book or whatever it might be, and that really includes them, and they can all talk about it. That then starts to change a little bit, I think, up the school. So we need to be really aware of that as teachers moving into the sort of upper ends of Key Stage 1 and through into Key Stage 2 and maybe even beyond. That and that's one of the reasons that we went towards this whole class approach for reading, was that their peers can then carry the load for the children who are either reluctant readers or who have a difficulty with, because they should not be excluded from the fabulous children's literature that's out there. You know, and there's absolutely no reason why they can't. We also now have we build in the fluency, build in reading aloud, teacher reads aloud models, pupil reads aloud models, and we've had some very, very affirming instances where we have children who are exceptionally reluctant readers and very struggling readers who are enthused enough to want to read aloud in front of their peers, and maybe we let them prep a bit beforehand, or maybe we're really careful to say, look, this is the bit you're going to read. But that's all about equality. It's all about sharing. It's about the self-esteem of the children involved. I have gone off completely your point about accelerated reading on platforms, and maybe that's an indication in itself what these platforms are about, in that they're not really that important. Now we use them, but for our school it's something like £1,700 a year. It's expensive. So maybe there's a time when we have to consider, is that the best use of money? So there are questions to be discussed around that, but definitely literacy there should be an equality in literacy. It shouldn't be the good children read the good books. Everybody should read the good books. And those children, I'll finish, but we would have had a reluctant reader who was in a class reading program. I forget the book. It might have been Wonder, or it could have been Boy in the Striped Pyjamas in primary 7. He was a struggling reader. They read that whole class. He took a quiz on the book, having been reading it as a shared. He got 9 out of 10. Now, what did that do for him? He couldn't read that book necessarily himself, but because of the reading was shared, the discussion around the book was shared, everybody was included. Now he just feels as good as anybody else. Brilliant.
Could I just say on that, for AR, I mean, if you're at a school that is using AR, there is an option for having listened to the book. So you can take that as an option. So the child can mark whether they've read it or listened to it, and they can take the quiz on the book that they've listened to as well. So that is an option for accelerated reader. But absolutely. There's no children with dyslexia or reluctant readers of any kind. It's not that they don't tend to love books. I mean, that's the thing. It defies conventional wisdom that if you struggle with something basic, you can't do something complex. But actually what we know is that, particularly with children with dyslexia, they're very capable of the complex. Where they're stuck is at the basic. And so audiobooks, really give that to them.
Sorry, just as well.
No.
And that's so true, because those children who might not be able to read the book, they can add so much to the discussion about the character, the plot. They could maybe even add, because their knowledge might be, and the background knowledge is something as well in Scarborough's Rope, they might be able to say a comment that is completely unconnected to what they have read, but it's what they know, and it enhances other children's understanding and maybe moves the conversation another way. And again, when they do that, self-esteem rises, self-confidence rises, the reading's maybe not such a bad thing, lowers, so there's a lot of positivity.
Donna, could I just add very quickly to that? In terms of platforms, Dr. Louisa Moats is one of the big leading lights, as we know, in the field, and she made the very seminal comment that programs don't teach children, teachers teach children. And that's the whole idea of the science of reading, is to put the informed teacher front and centre again in the classroom. And there's a lot of work for us to do to become as informed as we should be. The second thing I would say is, with comprehension, if we're going to use a platform such as Accelerated Reader, we have to make sure that when we teach comprehension strategies such as prediction, inferring, visualisation, summarisation, making connections, that we have enough of that background knowledge, not just to stoke it, but to build it. Otherwise, it's like planting or digging into very shallow soil. And so that depends on the vocabulary they have as well. So all of those strands of the rope are really important, and all of those things that we said about sharing that gradual release of responsibility, where the children see the teachers lifting the load as and when necessary, and then they get to share that load. And that's the lovely connectedness of what the science of reading keeps telling us to do. But any platform on its own, it's not going to do what the informed teacher can do in joining the dots for everyone.
Absolutely, Geraldine. And I think, Philip, you've demonstrated that in all those lovely examples that you've given, of the pedagogic use to which you put this particular resource or teaching resource.
Plus, if they watch enough Harry Potter films, they can be able to answer the questions, so.
So, Maria, how do you teach decoding effectively, asks Niamh.
Well, I'm delighted that Niamh is asking this question. So for me, in my experience in teaching, I know that word recognition and oral language comprehension are what get us to what we want, which is our end game, which is reading comprehension. But we have to follow the steps to get us to there. We can't just jump right in there. We need to follow the steps to get us there. And that first piece of the equation, the word recognition, is achieved through decoding. So children need to be very strong decoders. They need to be able to lift the words off the page. And to get to that decoding piece, they need to have very strong phonemic awareness, which I keep harping back to, but we know that the research around phonemic awareness is so robust that we can't not take it on board. This is so critical for our children to have this level of phonemic awareness. They can hear the sounds and the words, they can manipulate those sounds. That in reading is essentially the blending of those sounds. Spelling is the segmenting of those sounds. So for our children to be readers and spellers, they need to be tuned in to all of those sounds. You need to have a very strong scope and sequence. You need to know what your starting point is, and you need to know where you're working towards. And in each of those steps, teaching those sound spelling correspondences, you need to have recap and review. Children need the opportunities to constantly be going back and reviewing what they have been taught. Decodables. Decodables are essential, as I sort of alluded to it before. You cannot have a disconnect between your scope and sequence and what you're teaching in your phonics lessons and then hand children a level text. It's like going in and teaching children addition and then setting them down with a task that involves addition, multiplication, subtraction and division. You're setting a child up for failure. And once you do that, what decodables do is they set children up for success, because they open a book and they know, I've been taught these patterns. I know how to attack these words. And I feel that decodables have had a bit of a bad rap over the years, but I feel that that is adults who put that negativity onto decodables. From what we see, we think the stories aren't good enough, the vocabulary is not there, but actually they are critical for children to put those phonics things in practice. We don't want children to be brilliant at phonics. Phonics is a means to an end. Phonics is the road to get children to decoding, and that's what we have to look at these books for, and teachers have said to me before, but they look, they read level text and children seem to be flowing and fluent in their reading, and then they come to decodables and they seem so struggled and so laboured. And my response to that would be that this is a cognitive challenge for children, but we must see it as a positive cognitive challenge. This is what children need to become decoders. And then in giving them this practice through the decodables, we then build on those number of repetitions of children seeing those words and putting those phonics riddles into practice. Then you build the fluency, you build the automaticity and the accuracy, which then gets us paired with the oral language skills, which gets us to the reading comprehension piece. So I think that they are an absolutely critical element. We cannot match our phonics teaching and have strong scope and sequence and then give children level text that has words and patterns in there that they have no hope of being able to attack. We need to have both things matching so the children are getting this constant repetition.
And that emphasis on the problem solving, Maria, is incredibly important, isn't it?
Yes.
And having a positive
Yes.
kind of disposition towards that.
And to see children, we have children who are now reading decodables in primary 5, who the world of reading books up until this point it just has not happened. These children have completely switched off, because when they're handed a book, they have no chance of reading the words in that book. And to see these children now who are primary 5, who now see themselves as successful readers, because I can do what everybody else is doing.
Because the success
breeds the motivation, and
the lack of success becomes evident mid-primary. They were doing so well up until here, but the pictures go in the books, the complexity increases, and the code isn't there. They haven't learned enough code at that point.
And we don't want children to be guessers. We don't want children to guess words. There are lots of ways to guess a word. There's only one way to read a word, and that is so critical. And I listened to something, just to finish, I listened to something the other day, and it took me back to something that I did in the whole class setting years ago, which was a big book activity where we were reading the paragraph together, and I used yellow sticky notes to cover some of the words, and then we would read the paragraph together, and then we would guess what was behind the yellow sticky note. Now, when I was taken back through this memory of listening to this the other day, I was absolutely horrified that here I was teaching reading, but what was I doing to teach reading? I was covering the very word that I wanted the children to read. And to me, that realization of these strategies that are not effective and efficient, we know that the best route for children to decoding is that decoding is the most efficient and effective way for children to get to word recognition, not through guessing.
Yeah, so if I can just add to this, Maria, Dr. Magennis talked about phonemic awareness and that ability to recognize the 44 sounds or phonemes in the English language. And then Maria just touched upon, decoding, cracking the written code of English through graphemes, connecting those to the phonemes. So we see how that's all connected. But then we also see sight recognition. And a lot of times I feel historically we have taught sight words and kind of interchangeably said high frequency words, and we've taught them through rote memorization. But actually there's a connection to the phonemes and as well as the phonics that you'd use in decoding. What we found now is that if we tap into our brain's ability to orthographically map the letter sounds and those graphemes into words and later larger units, it's more effective. So we're looking at what we used to think of those high frequency words that we needed to learn on flashcards, like Maria said, and actually saying, no, let's get children to map those, representing the sounds that they know There's one method called the heart words. So if there is an irregular grapheme, which there aren't many in the English language, not as many as people think, but if there is an irregular one, or one perhaps that they haven't yet learned, we can identify that. But let's get them to map the sounds that they do know, and that's far more effective. So then it really, each thing plays into the next, and we just have the evidence that that is the most effective practice, and that rote memorization works for very few.
And I read recently that sight recognition in this context actually means you have decoded so quickly it is automatic. So you recognize it by sight, not because you've memorized it, but because you've got that irregular rule down so well that you no longer need to, be laboured in the way you decode the word, as opposed to our understanding of sight word, which puts a lot of weight on the memory.
Exactly. And that any word can be a sight word. Any word you could recognize. There are people in the medical field who have sight words that are not ours. Ours, we would have to decode them phonetically in order to understand them. So that, it's not just those high frequency words, but a variety of words.
An interesting point you'd mentioned about the decodables, and there's some people maybe a bit skeptical about them because of the vocabulary. But the vocabulary's there on Scarborough's rope. It's not necessarily sitting beside decoding. That maybe is that's a role for the richness of the classroom, the variety of the curriculum, the teacher's delivery. So vocabulary isn't necessarily connected to the book that they are reading or they are decoding. It's connected to their whole experience in the school. I think that's a really important point for people to take away.
Just sorry to add to that, the oral language, we didn't really delve into oral language, and we certainly, Dr. Magennis is going to share an amazing project she's working on, the Science of Reading Northern Ireland Facebook group, and so we'll be able to delve into all this much more. But when you talk about decodables, some kind of teachers and others in the community think that it's going back to the very basics, and that you're only just trying to hammer in phonics. Phonics is one small piece of a very large picture. But certainly oral language gives us that opportunity for that rich vocabulary, and to add that while children are learning to read. We're just saying don't do both at the same time. Explicitly teach one, engage in a rich oral language curriculum at the same time, and then the two shall meet.
Yeah, that's totally. They can't become reading comprehenders until they become oral comprehenders.
Yeah. And I think that's a good point to end our discussion. I think that was fantastic. There were so many wonderful points raised, and I think it really reflects what the science of reading is all about. And as I said earlier, we are on a journey. We're only learning, we're discovering, but really what it's about is effective practice and research-based effective practice for both typical and atypical learners. And the more we can find out about, the effective practice and what works and what's impactful, obviously the better. Folks, I think I just finished with asking you all, to maybe suggest one piece of advice or one final comment that you'd like to make before we leave our viewers.
I would say, I would invite the viewers to be curious about the science of reading. As I said at the start, there's no panacea to life and learning because it's so complex. But if you do start on this journey, one thing is you'll be very excited quite quickly. I'll guarantee you of that. But try not to become overwhelmed where you might feel this is so enormous and there's so much of a challenge. There's a tsunami of information coming to me and I have to go into my school and change everything. Just take a little thing at a time. Like Philip started with fluency, Maria started with the phonemic awareness and decodables, and take it easy and take your peers along with you. It is a very exciting journey. Just try not to drown in it all in the first instance.
Thank you, Geraldine. Maria.
Well, I think it'll come as no great surprise. I've sort of mentioned it a few times today, but for me, it's definitely understanding the phonemic awareness piece and how the phonemic awareness aids is essential really for the children to be able to be decoders, which then gets us to the end game, as I say, which is reading comprehension. It's for teachers to just ensure that you know what phonemic awareness looks like. What types of activities could you bring in to your classroom to really ensure that these children are strong with phonemic awareness, that you're making sure that you're constantly giving them many repetitions of mapping those sound symbol correspondences. That is I can't hit home hard enough how important that is for you to have that really explicit teaching. And, some children will have 4 repetitions of you saying something and they'll get it. We have children sitting in our classrooms who need 200 repetitions before that becomes embedded. And we just need to be, cognizant of that and really try and get those number of repetitions and that phonemic awareness piece in, and go out and, just find out what phonemic awareness is all about and how you can start putting it into place in your classroom.
Great, Maria. Thank you. Philip.
Okay, well, this one has just come to me. But it's interesting. Maria and I are kind of coming from the opposite sides of the rope, but we're coming from the opposite sides of the rope for the same reason, in that we were starting to recognise that continually repeating what wasn't working was still not going to work. So the science of reading gives you evidence and a direction to try to model something different in class, or to work with your children. And in fact, there's evidence there is really important. There's a whole raft of information as well to support that, but don't get, as Geraldine said, drowned in it. Teachers, particularly up to school, modelling reading, showing their children that they are readers. You cannot expect them to become readers if they do not see you as a reader. Parents at home, read aloud to your children as well. That's direct to camera, isn't it? So, because that is so, so important. The more they hear, the more stories they hear, the more they talk about stories. And that's the oral thing coming in again. That is so important. And the last thing is take a risk, because you'll end up with a reward. Maybe not the first time or the second time, but you will. Take a risk with your teaching, and the science of reading is a kind of a good blanket to cover yourself in for that risk.
Great, Philip. Thank you very much. And Jodi.
I just want to say that, every child should have the opportunity to be literate and to leave primary school working to their potential. And through the science of reading, we know that that's possible. We just need to build the capacity in schools to make that happen.
Thank you, Jodi. That's a perfect note to end on. And I think before we leave our viewers, Geraldine, you wanted to just
yes,
something up.
This is a shameless plug, but for further information, one of the podcasts that Maria and Philip and Jodi and myself have alluded to is Amplify, and Amplify has a whole swathe of podcasts, and you will get sucked in very quickly, but it's a good place to start. And again, they have show notes that go with with each episode. And so start gently, but do continue with it. The other thing is, Jodi and I have been working on a Science of Reading Northern Ireland Facebook page, which hopefully by the time this broadcast goes out, it'll be up and running. So please come and visit us there. Again, we are just learning like everyone else. And finally, St Mary's will be doing a Teams online discussion or information session, 1 or 2 of those in the near future. So do watch out for those.
Thanks, Geraldine. So thank you everybody for viewing. On behalf of the panel, thank you for giving us your time, your attention, and good luck with looking into the science of reading. Bye now. Bye.